Okay, last time we left off was engine cooling. So oil system, I think this is part 3, so if you want to put part 3, because on the quiz tomorrow, it'll say quiz O2B engines and systems part 3. Is it part 3? Okay, alright. So, next thing we're going to talk about is the engine oil system. It contains a whole bunch of stuff. Here, I'll just let you write it down. They all start with the letter O. In fact, I guess that's it. Pump, tank, lines, filter, cooler, pressure gauge, temperature gauge. And I'm not even including everything in there. So let me start with the oil pump. The oil pump pulls the oil out of the oil tank and pushes it to all the parts of the engine. It pushes the oil to all of the moving parts of the back of the engine. And it's got gears, so if the oil pump is spinning, there's no switch. You can't turn it on or off. It's almost identical to that of a car. The oil pump is bolted to the engine. Pumps oil. You got to have an oil tank because you got to have a place to store all this oil. Right here, it has a sun, and it would be hanging right here, and it's actually a separate tank. Some airplane, like most cars, they have effectively an oil pan. The bottom of the engine is where the oil is stored. When you go read a pilot operating handbook, it'll say the capacity of this engine is 8 quarts, but don't ever go flying unless you have at least 6. So you're going to need to know that as a pilot every time you fly a new airplane, is you're going to have to look up in the pilot operating handbook and see what is the minimum amount of oil I can have in the tank before I go flying. If that's an FAA approved pilot operating handbook, now you have to follow it. It's also a really, really good idea. Oil lines. Now, most cars, the oil passages are inside of the engine, and most of the oil lines on airplane engines are similar. But every now and then, there's a few extra ones. It's hard to see way in the back. I don't think I have a good picture, but some of the oil inside of the engine to get oil from one place to another. I'd say 95% of the piston-powered engines there or more have an oil filter. And that gets rid of junk, the oil. It doesn't keep pumping through the oil or pumping the engine and wear out the engine. Let's say you get sand and dirt in there for some reason, and it keeps pumping it through the engine. That sand and dirt is going to scrape the inside of the engine parts, and slowly it's going to scrape the metal off, and the inside of the engine will be ruined. So you need to have an oil filter, and you need to change it every so often. There are some older engines that don't have a filter. In that case, they just have a screen. It's literally, the holes are about the size of a window screen to keep out the bugs. And if that's the case, you need to change the oil every 25 hours. Most of the time, on airplane engines with filters, you change the oil every 50 hours. But think about that. Let's say you're going 100 miles an hour, and you go for 50 hours. How many miles is that? I know it's tough. Get out your calculator. What's 50 hours times 100 miles an hour? 5,000. So it's about 5,000 miles. Which newer cars, that's usually a recommendation. Oil cooler. We looked at an oil cooler out in shop or out in lab before. They also have an oil cooler. Effectively, air across it and you blow oil through it. going to need pressure and a temperature gauge. Those last two gauges are actually mandatory by the FAA. Has anybody ever driven a car and the oil pressure light came on? What do you do when the oil pressure light comes on, Johnny? 10 minutes later, a half an hour later? How long do you drive the car with the oil pressure light on? That's my question. Hang on. Don't drive at all. So what were you going to say, Jerry? Pull over immediately. Okay, in airplanes, if you start the engine up, when you start the engine up, the very first thing you look at is the oil pressure gauge. If that needle doesn't start moving, doesn't have to be in the green area, but it's got to at least start because the oil's thick. It's got to start moving within 30 seconds. If it doesn't move within 30 seconds, you shut the engine off by the time you get to 30 seconds. It's the same with a car. It's the same with jet engines. If you start the engine and the oil pressure doesn't even move, you need to shut it off because it could be going to the oil pump is broken and you have no oil pressure. If you're driving along in your car and the oil pressure comes on, this is what I tell people I teach how to drive. You need to pull over and the engine needs to shut off within 30 seconds of that light coming on. Otherwise, you can expect to have inside engine, and it won't be adding a couple of quarts of oil. It'll be an engine overhaul for $2,000 or $3,000. It's the same with airplane engines. So that's the very first thing you do. Of course, if you're flying along in flight and the oil pressure light comes on, it may take more than 30 seconds to get down to the ground, but in that case, you're trying to save your life and that of your passengers, and you're not so much worried about whether the engine is fried at the end. Oil temperature is also a required gauge in the airplanes. In cars, nowadays, I own an 07 Prius. Is it 07? Yeah, it's an 07 Prius. And it can have an oil temperature gauge. Is the radiator fluid getting hot or not? That oil correction, when that temperature light comes on in your car, you're driving oil and the water light comes on. Sometimes it's a little picture of a thermometer. How long do you have, Johnny, before you need to pull over and shut the engine off? How much? 30 seconds. Yeah, it's the exact same thing because the engine could get really, really hot and things expand and break and be very, very unhappy. So when I teach people to drive, I say those two lights, if it comes on, don't drive to the next exit. Don't drive home. Don't drive to the nearest auto repair shop. Don't call somebody while you're driving. Pull off to the side of the road and shut the engine off. The worst that'll happen is you'll be stuck and you might have to tow the car, but a $100 tow is, again, a lot more cheaper than a $1,000 or $2,000 overhaul. Now, so here's a picture out of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. And you can see if I can use those. Here, I got this thing. So over here, let's look at this gauge. Here's a pressure gauge. You notice there's a red line at the top and a red line at the bottom, and then in the middle there's a green arc. Effectively, these red lines are literally called red line. That's one word, red line. The oil pressure is never supposed to go above it, and the top one, and the oil pressure is never supposed to go below the bottom one. So if you start this engine up and it starts running, now granted that lower red line is based on the engine has started to warm up. So if you're in North Dakota in the middle of the winter and the oil's really cold, it might take 2 or 3 minutes even to get up to the lower red line. But once the engine's warm, it should always stay between those two red lines. And in fact, the green arc, very, very happy. That's where you want it to be. If I was flying along and it was not in the green arc, I would be wondering why. Is the oil pressure too low? Is the oil pressure too low? My first thought is it's low on oil. But it could be somebody put oil in there that's too thin. They put in like 10 weight oil instead of 50 weight oil, and 10 weight oil is thinner. So when it gets hot, it's really, really thin like water, and the pressure won't stay up. So that would be my first thought if the oil pressure was too low. Either I don't have enough oil or somebody put the wrong oil in. If the pressure's too high, again, maybe somebody put too much oil pressure, put the wrong oil in it that's too thick, or, and it's not on the list, but there is an oil pressure regulator in the system, and maybe it got stuck and is forcing the oil pressure to stay too high. oil temperature gauge, on the other side of this gauge, you'll notice there's a red line at 245 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's very typical for a lot of airplane engines. That's the temperature of the oil is 245. Now, the most likely time for it to get too hot is when you're climbing at full power, but you're in a climb and you have a slow forward airspeed, so not very much air is blowing through the engine. If not much air is blowing across the fins, it's not cooling the air down as much. If not much air is blowing across the oil cooler, it's not cooling the oil as much. But you've got the throttle shoved all the way forward and you're burning a lot of fuel. So you're generating a lot of heat, but you're not getting rid of as much. So the most likely time for you to have the oil temperature go too high is 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes after you took off, but you still have the throttle at a very, very high power setting, and the nose is pulled up so you're climbing, but you're going slowly. So if it started coming up towards that 245, you've got two choices. You can reduce the power setting by pulling the throttle back, but in a little tiny training airplane, it probably means you can't even climb. The best typical thing to do is usually push the nose forward, and if you're climbing at 80 knots, try climbing at 90 knots. You won't climb quite as fast, but a lot more air will blow through the airplane engine, through the fins, and through the radiator, the oil cooler, and you can watch it and see if it stops getting hotter. So in this is not the best schematic on the whole planet, but let's see. Here's an oil pump. It's being spun by the engine. It actually pumps the oil through a screen and through a filter, and then past the sensors for the gauge, and it pumps it out to the rest of the engine, all the moving parts inside the engine. And it doesn't show it very well here, but the oil then, once it gets to all those engine parts, it drains to the bottom of the oil tank. It drains to the bottom of the oil tank, and there's a pickup tube from the bottom of the oil tank up to the oil pump. And then the oil does it all over again. Most oil is made from petroleum products, except for synthetic oil. And off the top of my head, I don't know what they make synthetic oil out of. Anybody have any? So what you're going to do, let's say you're on a takeoff. Let's say you're before takeoff. You're doing an engine run. If you've taxied out to the runway and the engine's been running for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, then the oil pressure ought to be somewhere above. It will certainly be above the red line, but it'll probably be in the green arc. And in fact, it might be a little high because the oil isn't really, really hot yet, so it hasn't thinned out. But that's okay. If you look at the oil temperature, on a day like today, let's say you're flying out of the Fresno Air Terminal, Fresno Yosemite International, and it's 88 degrees when you started the engine, the oil temperature is going to come up right away. In fact, look at that. This oil temperature gauge goes down to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Shucks, it's already going to be, the needle's already going to be moving when you see it. So it's going to be really easy to tell if these gauges are working or not. Now, if you were flying in North Dakota on a winter day, and let's just say it's freezing, let's say it's 2 degrees Fahrenheit below freezing, say it's 30 degrees Fahrenheit, you might have to run the engine for more than 2 or 3 minutes to get the oil temperature needle to move. And you might want to actually think about it. Do I want to sit here with the engine running for 5 minutes just so I can get that needle to move so I know that it's working? That would be something you would want to ask an experienced pilot that's used to flying in 30 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. I have flown in 30 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. Now, granted, I've got my own airplane. I will sit there for an extra 5 minutes because I'm not being charged $130 an hour. I will sit there because all I'm doing is burning a little bit of gasoline. I will sit there until I can see that needle start to move. Also, engine manufacturers will say, how warm does it have to be before you can take off? And the manufacturer of my engine says, as long as you can push the throttle all the way forward to take off power and it runs smoothly and doesn't cough or stutter or anything, then the engine's warm enough. They don't actually have a number that says you have to have this minimum oil temperature. All right, fuel systems. Fuel systems have a lot of parts. There's fuel tanks. I'm going to see how many of these times I can print the word fuel. Fuel lines. Oh, I didn't put fuel selector valve. You got to have, typically, you got to have at least one fuel pump. There are exceptions. You got to have a priming system. I'll talk about the primer system here shortly. You got to have some gauges that tell you how much is in each fuel tank. That's actually an FAA requirement. You have to have an indication system for each fuel tank. There's some really old school airplanes that had like 45, 65 horsepower engines, and the fuel tank was in front of the pilot, in front of the instrument panel, right behind the engine, and they literally had a cork with a cork in front of the windshield. That was the fuel quantity. The nice thing about it is it didn't require electrical. And that's why, one of the reasons why they did it is that old school airplane, like a Piper J3 Cub, when that airplane first came out, it didn't have an electrical system on it at all. No lights, no starter motor, no battery. You had to hand prop it and try not to have the propeller hit you in the head every single time you flew it. All right, so let's talk about fuel tanks. Fuel line over here, I think I got a picture. So this is a basic diagram of a fuel system in a low-wing airplane. If you go flying at Reedley College starting in January of next year or later, you're going to fly a Piper Tomahawk, a PA-38, and the wings on that airplane are lower at the bottom of the fuselage. The problem with that is the bottom of the fuel tank may actually be lower than the carburetor. So that means you're going to have to pump the fuel up to get to the engine. Not that that's terrible, but you'll notice in this diagram there's actually two pumps. There's an electric pump and there is an engine-driven pump. And the reason why there's two pumps is the engine-driven is that if one quits, the other one will still work. So the engine-driven pump, there's no switch for it in the cockpit. So if the engine is spinning, just like the oil pump, if the engine is spinning, this fuel pump is spinning. But what if this fuel pump failed? Now the engine would quit. So what you do is you turn on an electrical switch and you turn on the electric pump. Both of these can pump fuel to the carburetor. Now generally in these low-wing airplanes, you don't want to wear out the fuel pump, so you generally turn it on before takeoff and you look at the fuel pressure gauge to see if it's good, and away you go and you take off and you get past 1 or 2 or 3,000 feet and you turn the electric pump off. Because if the engine-driven pump quits, you'll have time to turn on the electric pump. Also what you'll do is when you're coming into land, you'll turn on the electric pump. So that way if the engine-driven pump quits and you're only 300 or 400 feet off the ground, the electric pump will still pump fuel to the carburetor. If you have a high-wing airplane, then generally they only have one fuel pump, because if it quits, gravity will make it. Literally, my airplane is so old school, it's got a high wing and a low carburetor. The distance between the fuel tank to the carburetor is about 3 feet. There's enough gravity there that it will pull the fuel from the tanks to the carburetor, and it doesn't even have a pump at all. Engine-driven pump, there's no electric pump. I love that. So as long as gravity is working, I'm going to be able to get gasoline to the carburetor. Now this strainer is really just a very, very, very fine mesh. It's a lot finer than a window screen. I don't have a number on it, but it'll keep out all sand, and it'll keep out most dirt. Because the carburetor is a little bit on the sensitive side. If too much dirt or crud gets into the carburetor, it can make the carburetor not work. So you always want to have a fuel strainer before it gets to the carburetor. This primer on the right-hand side of the diagram is literally just a little hand pump. It sucks fuel from the fuel strainer, and it'll actually pump fuel out to the engine cylinders. It bypasses the carburetor. It does not go through the carburetor, and it squirts in the fuel just before the intake valve, just before the cylinder. If you an extra rich mixture and plenty of gasoline. Is anybody driven an old school car like from the 1960s or the 1970s where you get to the car and it's the first time you started it, the engine's cold? What do you do to the accelerator pedal before? Injection. The computer knows that you're starting it up and it'll squirt in a little extra gasoline. But these carburetors are not computer controlled. So effectively, that's what you're doing is you're squirting a little bit extra fuel just before it gets into the cylinder to make it to start. Now, the fuel selector valve, that you can't see it very well, but in this kind of a low-wing airplane, it's a 3-position switch. You can burn fuel off the left tank, you can burn fuel off the right tank, and you can turn it off. Can anybody think of a time in flight where you would turn this valve to the off position? What's that? Had an engine failure? Well, not at first. At first, you would want to do something that you want the engine to keep running. I'll give you a hint here. If you turn it to off, the engine won't run any longer. Well, you're technically correct. If engine failure, and you did everything you could to get the engine to run, and you still couldn't get it to run, if you leave this on and you have an if the engine quits in flight, one of the last figured out that there's no way to get the engine going to the OFF position. Can anybody think of another flying along in your Piper Tomahawk, you're with your instructor on your solo cross country, reason why you would rotate that lever to off in flight? I know we don't think about this very often because it doesn't happen, but if it happens in a car, it's a lot easier to save your life than it is in an airplane. If there's an engine fire, that's exactly right. If there's an engine fire in flight, you're going to turn the fuel lever off and say, I'd rather have to land it in a grape field or an orange vineyard than die burning in the sky. Does anybody want to die while you're burning in the sky? I didn't think so. Okay. All right. So it would be because now hopefully the engine fire will stop. Yay! Right? Hopefully the engine fire will stop because no more fuel's getting to the engine. That would be my hope. That would be my hope. Anyway, normally if you're flying in a low-wing airplane, typically what you do is you'll take off on whichever tank you think is the fullest. Let's say you fill up both tanks, so you switch the lever to either side. It doesn't matter, and you'll take off and you'll fly for 30 minutes, and then so one light and the other empty, and it's always trying to roll, it's always trying to turn. After 30 minutes, you reach up and you rotate the lever, and you go to the other tank. So you burn a half an hour gas out of it. Half an hour back and forth and back and forth. Now there is a technique that some people like to use. It's not illegal. It's interesting. Is they want to make sure they get it. They're going on a long, long, long trip, and when they come into land, well, 4 hours of gas. It says if you in the day and it's visual meteorological conditions, the clouds, which is what you can do with a private pilot certificate, you have to be able to fly to your intended destination, plus you have to have 30 more minutes of fuel if you were still at cruise. So let's just say your airplane burns 6 gallons an hour at cruise. That's half of that, 3 gallons. You have to do your calculations and plan on taking off, flying, descending, landing at your airport, and still have 3 gallons left when you land. Okay. Do you really want to have 1.5 gallons in each tank? You're going to switch to one of them, and now you can't use the other 1.5 gallons in the other tank. So what some people in low-wing airplanes will do is literally, when they're getting close, about a fourth left, they'll leave it on one tank, and they'll burn it dry, and the engine will start to sputter. And all they do is reach over and turn the fuel lever to the other tank, and usually within 5 or 10 seconds, the engine fires up and works just fine. You got to understand, if you're flying along at 100 miles an hour and the engine stops producing power, the propeller still spins because the airflow blowing across it is spinning the propeller. If your engine absolutely died and you slow down to, say, 70 knots, the propeller is still spinning. Just from the wind blowing it. It's called windmilling. It actually isn't that great because it causes a lot of drag, makes you descend faster. So it's not like you have to worry about whether the starter motor works. It's not any worse than in flight if you grab the mixture control. What happens if you grab that red mixture control and you pull it all the way back? How much fuel goes into the engine when you pull the mixture all the way back? Zero. So if you were flying along in your airplane at cruise and you grabbed the mixture control and pulled it all the way back, the engine would stop producing power. Less air would go across the horizontal stabilizer, and that's keeping the tail down, so the tail's going to go up a little bit. The nose is going to go down, so the airplane's going to kind of enter a glide, which is good. But the propeller is still going to spin around. You could then immediately count to 10, and push the mixture back in, and the engine would start up again, because the ignition is still running. You didn't turn off the ignition. So it's not any worse than that. Some people believe that that's an acceptable practice. I'm lucky I fly an airplane that there's a position on both. You can have it on both for takeoff and both for landing, so I never have to make that decision if I'm going to do that. Anybody have any questions about fuel systems and little airplanes? All right. When I say refueling, I'm not talking about aerial refueling. I'm talking about putting gas in the airplane on the ground. Okay, let's do the precautions. I don't know why it's going funny like that. When I say refueling, little airplanes cannot do aerial refueling. We're talking about pumping gas into the airplane on the ground. The two things you got to think about when you're putting gas in the airplane for safety purposes, is static electricity and pumping the wrong fuel. Last time we talked about what would happen if you put in jet fuel in your gasoline-powered airplane. What's for sure going to happen? It's called what? Detonation. Because that kerosene in the jet fuel will lower the octane of that gasoline to a ridiculously low level. Jet fuel or diesel or kerosene has such a low octane you don't even measure it. It's like 2. So it dramatically lowers octane, and if you have really, really low octane gasoline, you're going to get detonation. So number one, when you go somewhere and pump gas, you need to make sure that aviation gasoline goes in, not jet fuel. So that's what I'm talking about, the wrong fuel. Like I said, in the old days when they had 80 octane and 100 octane, you needed to make sure if you had an airplane that took 100 octane that you didn't accidentally pump in 80 octane. It's okay to do it the other way around. The airplane that I fly needs 80 100 stuff. All right, static electricity. If you probably never noticed it, but if you pump gas into a car in most states, there's minimum state placards that have to be on the fuel, on the gas pump. And in California, there's like 7 different things. And it's what you're really supposed to do is before you start pumping gas, is put the nozzle in your tank and make sure that the metal nozzle is touching the metal tube that's sticking out of the car, and that's usually not a problem because they're all made out of metal. That way, if static electricity builds up in that fuel line, in that hose, or in your car, it's electrically connected to the pump, and the pump is connected to ground. So the electricity won't build up in your car, because it might, because it's on rubber tires. Of course, they also talk about don't get in and out of your car and rub your behind on a cloth seat, because now you may have a static electric charge on your rubber shoes and go back to pump gas, and you have static discharge where the fuel pump is, where that ain't going into the tank. So they highly recommend that you don't get in your car and then get back out while you're pumping. Besides, if you have a fuel spill and you're in your car, it's going to, you might have a gallon or 2 of gasoline on the ground by the time you have to do about it. Before you can do anything about it, I highly recommend you stand there, even if you've got the automatic on. Has anybody ever had the automatic pumper holder thing on and it actually came out and fell out of the car? I had that happen to me about a year ago. It was like, ah! I was standing right there. Yeah, it fell down on the ground. It's like, ah! Fortunately, when it hit the ground, it popped and stopped. But there was, I don't know, at least a quart of gasoline on the ground. At least a quart, maybe a half a gallon. It was like, well, let's see. Do I stand here in this gasoline and try not to have a spark? Or do I walk away and try to drive away, and hopefully that won't have a spark? So I backed up very slowly and went in and told the attendant, and it's like cat litter. You put it down and it absorbs it. It's also for oil, but cat litter also works pretty good for gasoline. The problem is if you take a broom and try to swish it, that causes static electricity and it can catch on fire. So you really need to suck it all up with cat litter. I'm not making this up. You need to cat litter. Okay. So literally when you're pumping gas in an airplane, Every single place I've ever been able to get fuel for a little tiny airplane, there is a cable with a clamp on it, and it's on a wheel, a reel, and you unreel it, and you clamp it to some metal, like where the chains tie down, or onto the exhaust pipe, or onto the landing gear. So static electricity cannot build up in the airplane. Okay, so let's talk about how much gas you need to have. So considerations. When I say considerations, I'm the considerations of how much fuel to put on board. Well, the first one is, how much fuel can I put on board the airplane and not make the airplane weigh too much? The airplane can't be too heavy. We're going to get into it in another chapter, but every flying machine, helicopters included, have a maximum allowable gross takeoff weight. For instance, the airplane that I fly around can weigh 2,300 when it leaves the ground. Well, empty, it weighs 1,400 pounds with nothing in it. It means I can put 900 pounds of stuff on it. Well, it holds 41 gallons of gas times 6 pounds a gallon. So that's a little, what is 6 pounds a gallon times 41? 6 times 4 is 24. So it'll hold 246 pounds of gasoline. So, okay, there's 900. I subtract 246. So now I'm down to 654 pounds. Okay, if I put me in the airplane, that's 400 pounds. I've only got 1 or 2 people left. I can't put that much stuff in it. And I got to count the cargo, because in the back of my airplane, I've got an extra quart of oil. I know, I'm kidding. I was exaggerating. I only weigh 380 pounds. But I keep a quart of oil in the back, and some chocks, and a tie down, and some extra tools, and some extra parts. So I got about 30 or 40 pounds of stuff in the back of the airplane. I got to take that into account. So if I start getting up to where I'm filling the airplane up, I may decide, I want to take an extra person with me. I may decide to not fill the tanks up. That airplane will go 5 hours. If I pull it back to best economy cruise, I can get 5 hours of travel out of it. Well, although the FAA says the minimum is I got to have to get to my destination plus 30 minutes, the Aviation Safety Foundation says they recommend. So what I typically do is I have 4 hours of gasoline plus an hour of reserve. So I say, okay, if I'm not put on so much fuel, I can't fly for 4 hours at 100 miles an hour. I can't go 400 miles. So let's say I only put half tanks. That means I can only go for 2 hours. Okay, but 200 miles an hour, I can get to L.A. Yeah. How far have I flown? In a little airplane or a big airplane? Okay, the farthest I have ever flown in one day in a little tiny airplane, I flew 11 hours. That Cessna 152 out there, the previous version of it had a very slightly smaller engine, so it went like 90 miles an hour instead of 100 miles an hour. I flew 11 hours in one day. I flew from Reedley to Las Vegas to Catalina Island and back to Reedley. I did it all in one day. It took me 11 hours. So that was probably just under 1,000 miles, which was a really long flight. 11 hours with the engine running, so it probably took me about 13 hours to do it. When I say 11 hours, that's the Hobbs meter. There's a little gauge that runs off of oil pressure, and when the oil pressure kicks in, it starts rotating, and that's how you pay for your rental, is off of the Hobbs meter. It's how many hours was the engine running. So even when you're taxiing around on the ground, you're paying for it. Okay. So it was 11 hours on the Hobbs meter. But that's also what you get to put in your logbook, is what the Hobbs meter says. So that probably took me, the 11 hours of flying, it probably took me 13 hours to do it. Because I had to stop for gas like 4 times, and I'm sure I had lunch somewhere. I just don't remember. That would have been in like 1978, 1979. The longest I ever flew as a required crew member was when I was a navigator. One time we flew from Guam to North Dakota. Of course, instead of going 90 miles an hour, we were going about 600 miles an hour, and it was 14 hours. Yeah. Pardon me? 14 hours at 500 miles an hour would be 7,000 miles. So it was a little more than that. We got gas. We did aerial refueling over Hawaii because the Hawaii Air National Guard, they always wanted somebody to pass gas with because they needed to practice pumping gas out of their aerial refuelers. But that's a long time. But There was four. There was 2 pilots, 2 navigators, electronic war officer, and a gunner. So we always make sure at least 1 pilot and 1 navigator were awake. One of each. So I remember my bombardier would say, "Yeah, I'm taking a nap. Wake me up in 2 hours." Okay. He actually brought a blanket and set it down on the floor. I'm not kidding. I never did that. I slept in my chair sometimes. All right, so how much fuel you can put on board impact how much cargo and passengers you can take with you. Or maybe the other way around, how much cargo and passengers you take with you may impact how much fuel you can put on board. And of course, how far do you want to go? If I just want to fly from Reedley to Bakersfield, it's a little over 100 miles. Shucks. Let's say at cruise, my airplane burns 8 gallons an hour. Let's say it takes a gallon to get ready for takeoff. So it's a gallon to get ready for takeoff. It's 8 gallons to get to Bakersfield. And a half an hour at 8 gallons an hour is only 4. So 1 plus 8 plus 4 is 13 gallons. I could actually take off with 13 gallons. But again, the AOPA Air Safety Foundation recommends an hour, so I'd put on that extra 4. That'd be 17 gallons. But if I have the capability, I usually put in as much fuel as I can safely take with me. So even if I'm only going to go flying for an hour, if it's just me and 1 other person, I usually just fill up the tanks. Yeah. Then it's really hard to run. I just do that as a habit pattern. Question? In the airlines, what do they do? The airlines, you got to understand, in a little tiny airplane, if I put in 4 hours of gas, I only need an hour. Did it take me a little bit more gas to haul that fuel around? It cost me a little bit of fuel to get to altitude. I'm going to have to use a little bit more fuel while I'm cruising, but I'm probably not going to notice it. If you're flying for an airline, instead of talking a quart of gasoline more or a pint, we're talking thousands of pounds. Let's say you're going to take off out of San Francisco and you're going to go to Hawaii. It's Hawaiian Airlines. So it's at 500 miles an hour. It's about 2,500 miles. Take 5 hours. The airlines have to have a 45-minute reserve, and they generally don't put on any more than the 45-minute reserve, because every time you put on an extra pound of anything, for a 5-hour flight, it might cost a pound of fuel to haul that 6 pounds. So why do that? Now, generally speaking, based on I've told you, each airline has a slightly different policy, but generally it's up to the aircraft commander. They can usually ask for an extra 1 or 2 or 3,000 pounds of fuel if it's legal, but they have to have a reason, usually. So not much. That 45 minutes, they might ask for 10 more minutes of gas. But you also got to understand, they plan extremely carefully. Me, I don't have to plan too carefully. If I've got an extra hour of gas and I'm off by 5 minutes, what do I care? But if they're using very sophisticated, they use very accurate forecast winds, and they monitor the flight. At this point, I should have this much fuel. If they don't, then they're going to do something about it. Of course, if you're halfway to Hawaii, it won't make a whole lot of difference, unless there's a lot of wind. But usually going to Hawaii, you have a headwind. But there's a whole other set of details which I don't have time to go over. So essentially, the airlines generally do not carry much more than the minimum. If you're going to fly instrument flight rules, and the airlines always fly instrument flight rules as if they might fly through the clouds, instead of 30 minutes, you got to have 45 minutes of reserve. It's the same at night. If you're flying a little tiny airplane, even if you're a private pilot and it's visual flying rules, you stay out of the clouds. If you fly at night, it's not 30 minutes of extra gas. It's now 45 minutes. I think it's because the FAA thinks it's a little easier to get lost at night. And of course, we've already talked about the fact that you need to make sure you have enough reserve. One nice thing about a little airplane like a Piper Tomahawk, it's got about 3.5 or 4 hours of fuel. Let's say it's got 4 hours of fuel. If it burns 6 gallons an hour, 4 times 6 is only 24 gallons. If it's got 24 gallons, and most training flights are 1.0 to 1.5, I'd say an average training flight is a 1.2 or a 1.3. Even with half tanks, you got nearly an hour reserve. So it's usually not a problem. What is a problem is people take off and they barely have enough fuel to be legal, and then the winds are stronger than they thought and they're blowing against them. And they aren't paying attention to what's going on. And all of a sudden they're getting close to their destination and they're looking at the gas gauges, which are unfortunately not that accurate in little tiny airplanes. And they're starting to wonder, well, am I going to make it or not? And then they decide they're going to make it, and then they run out of gas 5 minutes before they get to their airport. Instead of land somewhere else, get a few gallons and go. Oh, that'll take an extra 20 minutes if I have to land again. So it's a lot better to take off with as much fuel as you can safely carry. In a little airplane, burning that, especially if you're renting it, if you're renting the airplane, and you burn a little bit more gas, what do you care? Actually, all it'll do is it'll slow you down like a half of a mile an hour. You'll never even notice it. So when you're doing a pre-flight inspection, remember, the pilot in command is responsible for determining if the aircraft is in a safe condition for flight. So one of those things that the pilot in command is going to do, that's you as a private pilot, are going to be the pilot in command. You're going to literally open up the fuel tank cap and look inside. I highly recommend straw method. Some fuel tanks have a little piece of metal in there that's about halfway, so when you look in, you can see if that little piece of metal is covered or uncovered. But that still only tells you it's a little more than a half or it's a little less than a half. It's not very accurate. If you're going to fly an airplane, calibrate as you can. Airplanes, and somebody's designed it for that fuel tank. I have one of those, and it's extremely accurate. I think it's because I will fill it up and stick it in it, and it calibrated and how much is usable. Remember, there's fuel that's in the tank that you can't use, so it's calibrated and how much you can use, which is a lot more important than how much is in there. Done my straw trick. And I'll land and see how much is in each tank and then fill them up. And that straw, that tube is very, very accurate. So you need to check the quantity. Again, I'm going to say it again. The fuel gauges on little airplanes are notoriously inaccurate. They're pretty much there to tell you, what you think is happening is kind of sort of happening. You're also going to drain fuel out of the bottom of every tank. And you're doing this for two reasons. You're trying to get any sediment. What if when the last time somebody was pumping gas, a wasp flew in there? Or the wind was blowing and a little dirt or dust got in there? Or what if the cap, it doesn't seal that great and it rained in the last few days and water got in there? Just so you know, water does not burn with air easily. Has anybody ever seen water on fire? Not unless it had oil or something on it. Water doesn't burn. So water getting sucked into your carburetor, the engine won't work. And again, you don't want any sediment or dirt or crud in there. So you're always going to drain every single fuel tank. And then every airplane I've ever flown, in addition to every fuel tank, there's one spot on the airplane, it's usually underneath the engine, at the lowest point of the fuel system. You drain the tanks first, and then you drain that lowest point last. Because if some of that water or sediment got out of the tank and went towards the engine, it's slowly going to settle in that lowest spot, because that lowest spot will still have to come up 6 inches or so to get to the carburetor. So the water's heavier than gasoline. So you drain all the tanks, and then you drain it. On a little airplane like a Piper Tomahawk, there's probably one under each tank, and then there's the lowest point in the fuel system, and that's usually the fuel strainer, like I showed you before on this slide right here. In most little airplanes, see if I can find it, the fuel strainer is the lowest point in the fuel system, and you can drain fuel out of it, and everything else is higher. Okay, we will start exhaust systems next time. Let's see, in real life it's 12 after, so let's go to 23 after in real life. 23 after on an accurate clock.